Welcome to the DOS Champions podcast. We are coming at you this week with another Flavor of the Week session. As a reminder to our friends and family at home, the Flavor of the Week sessions are geared towards taking small subjects that are being discussed among the U.S. men's national team community and diving deeper into them. So you're not going to see roster selection overviews in Flavor of the Week or EPL roundups. You're going to see very specific talking points. I'm joined by my good friend, as always, Rian Tooney. Ryan, how you doing?
I'm doing really well, man. It's getting warmer out. That's nice. And, we're getting to come at something from a little bit different of an angle and, test the waters with a different type of viewpoint and analysis here. So I'm excited.
Hell yeah. So let's dive into it. The topic today is we'll quote it like this: to unlock Christian Pulisic's potential, we should play with Josh Sargent up front. I'm hesitant to even say up front. And Ryan, before we jump into this thing, maybe it makes sense to talk about why we're avoiding terms like forward or false nine or 10. We literally just had a conversation about this. I want to hear your perspective on this subject first.
Yeah. First, I think that we attach a lot of meaning to those numbering systems that maybe we don't intend to when we're having conversations. It's important to use as like consistent terms so people all kind of know, all right, on a piece of paper, when you line up the formation, this is where the guy lies. But it doesn't do that great of a job of filling out what I think a lot of people would call the role of the player. And that's where, terms like false nine or different modifiers you might put in front of the number, like an attacking eight or something like that, have to come in. And for the purposes of this, our conversation is much more about how a player's skill sets allow them to interact with the other players around them, and also how those skill sets allow them to fulfill particular roles on the field. And that's what Alex is kind of prefacing this with the whole, well, we're going to try to avoid terms like 9 and 10 or striker or whatever. In reality, it's going to be nearly impossible for us to avoid them. But you have been told this is more about what somebody's capable of with their skill set, how that interacts with the other players around them, and why that type of skill set would be useful in a certain spot for the national team.
Hell yeah. Thanks for doing that. And one last question for you. I know you had a conversation with our friend Dan back home. What was the terminology you guys arrived on for Josh Sargent's categorization?
Oh, yeah. I had to steal this from him. He goes with a box-to-box striker, which I think encompasses what's going on with Josh quite well.
Hell yeah. Well, I wanted you to get that out there. And basically what we're saying is that for all practical purposes, Josh Sargent should be occupying the position that Ricardo Pepi or Jesse Zardes or Jordan P. Folk would otherwise occupy, because it gives Pulisic the best chance to unlock his potential. And we thought we'd start off this conversation by talking about some of the weaknesses that are going to be knee-jerk reactions from our audience that don't agree with this idea. One of them is that Josh Sargent does not score goals. Ryan, what do you take of that argument that Josh does not score goals?
I think he scores some goals. I don't think he scores as many goals or goals at a frequency to be considered an out and out, ruthless striker type. But I think what we're going to get at here is that what the role of the nine or the striker in the national team system is supposed to be? Let's set aside a second what we think our system should be and go with what our system actually has been.
Yep. I can tell you that what our system has been is that over the last 2 years, less than 23% of our goals are coming from the nine, so to say. And the wings are doubling that clip. There's also a good handful of goals that are being scored from our eights. And I can tell you, per Kartek Krishnaiyer and some conversations we've had with World Soccer Talk, this is a global metric that's being recognized through the majority of the football community. More and more goals are coming from wing play and delayed runs from the eight, and less are coming from a traditional nine. And I think that's a really good data point in talking about, well, yes, Josh doesn't traditionally score a ton of goals, but neither does our nine. And I'm not sure that's what the purpose of our quote unquote nine is.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think that there's getting back to what skill sets allow the player to interact with their teammates well, and what skill sets make them a good person in the role that is needed within the squad. And it seems like there's a move toward more of a facilitator type in the position, and it looks like that might be what Berhalter prefers.
Agreed. And we see that in games where Jesus Ferreira is starting against El Salvador. By the way, he had a pretty outstanding game. I think he had like an 8.1 on Sova score with a big chance missed, and on another one, not a big opportunity that he created for himself, but at least a very good opportunity in terms of fan perspective that he did create for himself. It just seems that the players that are occupying that 10, false 9, whatever the hell you want to call it, role, they seem to be thriving there.
Yeah, it looks like we need a facilitator in that type of position. And I think what we're going to get at here is that type of player allows Pulisic to blossom more, and probably allows some of our other players to blossom more as well.
Yeah. So the other weakness people are going to see in this argument is they're going to, and this is so funny because we have a group of people that we really enjoy communicating with that call themselves Sargent Team 678, I believe is what they call themselves. And so a big part of the community is going to say Sargent doesn't play forward. And we do agree that he has some midfield qualities. But I don't think that's entirely true. And even if you examine his role that he plays for Norwich, his role is very similar to Kai's. If you look at their heat map and look at their outcomes in terms of numbers, the only difference that you're really going to notice is that Kai occupies more time in the center of the pitch while Sargent occupies more time on the right. And then when play develops, Kai tends to gravitate towards his dominant foot on the left, and Sargent, swings into the middle of the pitch a little bit more. But their roles on the field are very similar. Ryan, do you have any takes on that?
Yeah, I think that it's hard to see it on the heat map, and in that, because you're going to see Sargent looks like he's far over to the right because that's where he touches the ball more often, and Kai is a little bit more down the middle because that's how he's deployed, and then over to the left because that's where he's naturally that footed, and his interchanges with the other players on the field lend itself to his him moving onto his dominant foot with the ball. The big similarity that Alex is getting at here is that they both end up being kind of facilitators for the rest of the team. With Josh, it might be long balls played out to him and flick-ons, or it might be balls played into his feet where he's able to do a couple quick passes with teammates around him, though that is not as prevalent almost exclusively because of how infrequently Norwich has the ball, and that's just not their style of play. But you can tell when he passes that he is very, very capable of passing and moving and interchanging with those around him, and not necessarily being tied to a specific position. And to me, that's the big similarity here. I don't think they're the same player or anything like that, but this is less about like, oh, this guy scores lots of goals for Chelsea and this guy is working his dick off for Norwich. It's these guys actually kind of perform a similar role within their teams, and that is an outlet for offense to run through. You actually, Alex, there's a really good line that you had that speaks to this, that both Kai and Josh are gateways in the midfield. And I think that kind of encompasses it. The one for Norwich,
Yeah.
Josh's gateway's out to the right-hand side more often than not, and Kai is a little bit more through the middle. But I think it stands to reason that if Josh were deployed as a false nine-esque or, that type of player for the national team, we'd see some good things happening in terms of his ability, specifically to interchange with Pulisic.
Yeah. And so to the weakness of the argument that Josh doesn't play forward, so why would we put him at 9? We would say don't get caught up in the semantics of the title of the position or the name of the position. For the players that play next to Pulisic, Josh Sargent has very similar qualities. And throughout the rest of this pod, we're going to talk about how Josh Sargent and Kai Havertz are similar. And then the final weakness that you might think about in this argument, where it's like, well, why would we play with Sargent when we can play with a Ricardo Pepi or Jordan Pifo? Those are way better options. some people might say that the evidence is lacking to say that Pulisic doesn't play well with a traditional nine. And it seems to us, if as we examine the data on Pulisic's club career, that when he's in an ideal situation, he's playing better with somebody who plays more interchanging football. So I think this is most clearly evidenced in situations like in this most recent Champions League fixture against Lille, where despite having Lukaku and having paid a ton of money for him, Chelsea decided to roll without that traditional nine.
Yeah, they're getting a lot more out of their offense in general when Kai is on the field, and Pulisic is a big beneficiary of it, but the entire setup is also a beneficiary of it, and that's why they're in all likelihood going to keep rolling with it. The game over the weekend against Burnley also showed that again, that the extra movement up top and the ability to have good interchange and help each other create pockets of space via that interchange rather than having a more static focal point is very, very valuable.
Yeah, and so I want to touch in a little bit more on that because we talked about this potentially being one of the weaknesses of the argument, that the evidence is lacking that Pulisic plays well with a false 9 or 10 or whatever you want to call it. But that's actually one of the first premises of this entire argument, is that Pulisic, in fact, plays better with a Kai Havertz or somebody who's got the qualities of a 10. And we think that the reason is because he's able to interchange with his partners in the attack, and he's able to do it in a space that allows him to put defenders on their heels a little bit more quickly than he would if he were playing out of the midfield or if the striker was stretching the defensive line instead of letting Pulisic kind of play that role. But regardless of the rationale or what we see on tape, his best games have come in games without a traditional 9 on the field. So if you look at his game against Lille, which in the Champions League, which I do consider one of his best games at Chelsea, why wouldn't we? He scored, and they rolled with Kai Havertz up top. And if you look at when he scored against Real Madrid last season in the Champions League, they also played a game without a traditional 9. Now, granted, Kai Havertz wasn't on the field, but they played a 3-5-2, and the two were Pulisic and Timo Werner. But there wasn't that traditional tower standing, pushing the defensive line back. And then again, Liverpool played Chelsea on January 2nd. That was a great game for Pulisic. He scored. Chelsea drew 2-2, and that was a game in which they deployed Kai Havertz, Pulisic, and then the third player on the field escapes me. I believe it was Mason Mount, but I'm unsure.
Yeah.
It was. Okay. So, Tuni, you have any takes on that topic there or anything that you'd like to add on to it?
Yeah, the big thing for me is I think it has to do with increased unpredictability. Why it helps Pulisic so much. Ideally we want Pulisic picking the ball up in the on the left hand side with space to be able to run at players. And I think the more static the central player is, the more that becomes predictable. And the more fluid the central player is, the less that becomes predictable. So if the central player is able to kind of like move toward the outside and pick up the ball, then there's pockets of space more for Pulisic to pick up the ball in central areas. And I just think that type of shifting and allowing him to float a bit, him being Pulisic to float a bit and find those spaces that are working best for him at the time, is a really big deal. And some of this you got to ignore how crowded it seems to have gotten at times, and I think there's a little work that needs to be done in terms of the interchanging for the men's national team with this. But I really do think that the proper movement and ability for these players to occupy different spaces will allow Pulisic to get on the ball in different various areas and then be able to push forward with it and keep the opponents having to guess where to move to.
Yeah, I agree. I guess like the final piece of evidence that I would want to introduce in saying that Pulisic plays better without a traditional 9, or Pulisic specifically plays better with a Kai Havertz or somebody who's playing that false 9 or 10, is that Tuchel has one of the best traditional 9s in the world. It's probably one of the best 3 players to occupy that position in the world right now. You probably got Lewandowski is a great option. Erling Haaland is a great option. Maybe Karim Benzema and Romelu Lukaku.
Mm-hmm.
Like those are top tier, and you could argue which one is better than the other. But Tuchel's got that card in his hand, and he's deciding not to play it more and more frequently. And I don't think it's because he imagined that it would be good or wants to do it. I think he's doing it because the evidence is showing that the offense just flows better without that false nine, without that standard nine, and Pulisic is much more effective with a player like Kai Havertz. So if Thomas Tuchel's doing it, then I don't know why we wouldn't do it on the men's national team, or at least try to replicate it.
Yeah, that's a pretty solid argument, in my opinion.
Okay. So, the second premise of this is that, if you can agree that Pulisic does play better with somebody who plays that 10 type of role or that false nine like Kai Havertz, the second part of this argument is like, well, then who's similar to Kai Havertz? And I believe that Josh Sargent actually has a lot in common with Kai Havertz. So we already talked about their heat maps. Both of them occupy a very strong presence in the midfield. At the very least, their heat maps are distinguished from the likes of Romelu Lukaku, Ricardo Pepi, or Jordan Pefok. And as we said earlier, both Kai and Josh are gateways to the midfield. Like, we said Kai spends a lot more time in the middle than Josh, but the interchange between other players is very similar. But here's where things get really interesting. Kai and Josh have very similar productivity metrics. They have similar passing metrics, global passing metrics, similar global dribbling metrics, and similar defensive metrics. And while Josh Sargent is in a higher percentile for all things defensive metrics, it's only because Norwich never have the ball and Josh is getting an opportunity to inflate those metrics. And while Kai has a higher percentile for passing metrics, if you level the KPIs for each of their core groups, so if you take the possession and try to simulate an experience where Chelsea isn't dominating possession or Norwich is, their defensive metrics become very similar. If you try to look at metrics such as touches or progressive passes received that would dictate other passing metrics, namely by having more opportunities to complete passes, Josh and Kai are actually very similar. And despite the polar opposite ways that Norwich and Chelsea play, their overall control of possession metrics, the dribbling metrics, are very similar. You don't even have to make adjustments. And their outcomes are very similar. Each of them have 1 goal and 2 assists in league play, despite Kai having 3 times the net expected goals and assists. So some people might consider this comparison whack because Kai's such a coveted talent and has been for such a long time. But the metrics don't say that, and the data doesn't say that. So, Ryan, I'll let you get a word in and ask questions if I've made any of that unclear. I'm sure some of our audience is like, what the hell did Alex just say?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a reach to just say, Alex isn't saying that Josh Sargent is as good as Kai Havertz. He's saying that when you, account for the difference in the possession, they actually perform a very similar role within their teams. I don't know that I would expect Josh Sargent to produce in the same way that Kai Havertz does if he was, doing the exact same, like if he was on Chelsea, basically getting the same number of minutes. I don't know that I would expect that. But I would expect him to be able to perform pretty admirably in terms of his way to interchange and pass. And I bet he would have quite a few assists in that type of setup. The goal scoring, though, I do have concerns about Josh's ability to be ruthless in front of net, and I think Kai's probably a bit smoother with that. But
agree. Kai seems to be way more composed in front of goal, and I'm happy to point out any weaknesses in this thing.
And that once again really isn't the point. The point is that they're both very, very capable as being facilitators for the players around them, and that is something that the U.S. men's national team looks to be trying to do currently. I guess that's the most I got in response to into them being similar. I think people and I'll just put a little caveat in here to end this, that people seem to get really, really bent out of shape about making comparisons about players that you just can't compare or whatever, like it's some sort of cardinal sin. Framing super important and trying to understand, why certain metrics are enhanced, as Alex pointed out, when you don't have the ball versus do have the ball. And then really like look at, what roles are they playing for their teams and what levels or styles of play do those teams have, and then what overlap do we see within that framing, and that's what's being highlighted here.
Yep. And I should note that we're going to have a written piece coming out that specifically illustrates the metrics and how they're tied together and when they're weighted differently, what kind of outcomes you'll likely see in them. So if any of this stuff is confusing, just reference the written piece, and we'll make sure to get that over to you guys soon. But a few more similarities before we advance on from this point. Both of them are 6'1", 176 pounds. Both of their teams use them in a similar fashion, and both of these players excel at hold-up play. That's kind of what their bread and butter is. I mean, that's very much what Sargent is known for. So there's some similarities to these two, both physically, the ways that their team in the way that their team uses them, and then as we've mentioned already in terms of their statistic outcome. I mentioned earlier each player, Josh and Kai, have both registered 1 goal and 2 assists in league play, despite Kai having. Go ahead.
I mean, Kai just scored 2 goals against Burnley.
Oh well, there goes that data point. No, yeah. that's thank you for calling me out on that. So that puts Kai at 3 goals and 2 assists in league play, and Sargent at 1 goal and 2 assists in league play. So yeah, you can pretty much redact that point.
Well, and doesn't Josh actually have 2 goals because he scored twice?
Oh, there you go. All right, so it's not so far off. See, these notes were edited about a week ago, and so they're a little bit off. But Ryan, thank you for keeping me honest. Regardless, similar goals and assists for each of the players. Both routinely start in the EPL. I know a lot of people are going to say, well, why don't you just compare calendars to applesauce if you're going to draw lines that are that vague? But it's no small thing to start in the EPL. And I do give each of those dudes credit for being able to do it.
It's not a small thing at all.
It's not a small thing. And both of them have German roots. And I don't know how much this actually changes things or means anything, but I do believe that there are certain technical styles of play that come from certain cultures. Whether you're growing up in Spain from the ages of 18 to 21 or 22, or from 16 to 22, or Germany or Italy or France or Brazil or Argentina. There are different styles of play that you get from the training that exists in those cultures, and they both have German roots, and it's not crazy to think that they may have picked up on some similar principles that might complement Christian Pulisic well.
I actually agree with this quite a bit. I think they both probably picked up their ability to hold the ball up and have those short passing and interchange with the people around them, just general good play that comes from a lot of short passing drills and interchange and stuff. You see that written over both of their styles of play.
Yeah, agreed. And so, we've kind of spelled out that Pulisic, throughout the course of this pod so far, we've spelled out that Pulisic plays well when he has somebody to interchange with, like a Kai Havertz, and we've done the best that we can to demonstrate that Sargent is the closest thing that we have in our pool to Kai Havertz. And I think the third point is that there's no other men's national team pairing for Christian Pulisic that is remotely close to Kai, or Josh for that matter. P-Folk and Pepe, they're more similar to Lukaku. They're the types of players that are going to hang out around the mouth of the goal if they can. They're going to push the defensive line by standing right in front of or right next to that center defender, but they're not going to be players that routinely check into the midfield, or what Ryan called that box-to-box striker. That's just not the type of player that they are.
No, they can be useful in their own way, but if we're talking about trying to get the most out of the other players around them, we're not finding them excelling in those type of skills like Josh or Kai.
So Ryan, I think that just about concludes this flavor of the week pod. We've done the best that we can to show you why Sargent and Kai are similar. I personally advocate for Sargent being the guy who occupies our starting 9. I'm reluctant to even call it a starting 9, but I believe that Sargent is the right guy to do that, and that's coming from a dude who's defended P-Folk tooth and nail for the last 3 months.
I'm one that will caveat it a bit and say that, if we really are trying to play with a false nine, if we're trying to make the guy that is up that's leading the line less to try to push the defensive line back and run the channels, and more into checking back to the ball and bringing others into the play and pulling the center backs out of position for wingers to run into that space, then Josh Sargent is probably the best for that role.
Hell yeah. Well, from us at DOS Champions, we appreciate the listen. And I anticipate either later this week, we're aiming for Thursday or Friday, we're going to try to come at you with a pod on sudden cardiac death over 2021. Ryan, any closing remarks for our fans at home?
Well, just have a good night, everybody, or morning or afternoon. And yeah, take it easy.
All right, y'all. Take care.